Thank you very much for having me. And yes, my research focuses on scientific storytelling, which is what we're going to talk about today. But first, I want to get to a specific context. So let's talk about vaccines for a second. So vaccines, I think, represent a nice scientific context in which there's pretty much scientific consensus. Vaccines work, they're effective, they're safe. Because of vaccines, we have eliminated many diseases that has plagued mankind for a long time. So, vaccines, right? However, many states have experienced significant decreases in vaccination rates. A 2015 Pew Research survey finds growing doubts about the practice of mandatory vaccines. And in 2014, there was a record number of measles since measles was declared eliminated in 2000. So we seem to have this conflict. So what's going on here? A lot of stuff's going on here. So I'm not going to say that I have the answer, but let's look at one thing that might be happening, and that is how these two sides are using communication. So if we look at a pro-vaccine website, so I just searched and picked one, so here's U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, 5 important reasons to vaccinate your child. If you read through, you see things such as immunizations can save your child's life, vaccination is very safe and effective, protects you and others, saves your family time and money, protects future generations. Okay, make sense? So now let's go to an anti-vaccine site to see what they say. And again, I just did a random search. The Healthy Home Economist, 6 reasons to say no to vaccination. And what we see in here are things such as, for compelling anecdotal evidence, ask moms with several children, some of whom are vaccinated and some of whom are not, which of their children are the healthiest. In my own circle, the moms I know who have 1 or 2 kids who are fully vaccinated and the younger kids who did not get any shots tell me that, hands down, that the unvaccinated children are healthier and have less problems. Okay, so what do you notice about the difference between these 2 types of communication? Boom.
Well, one is anecdotal. I mean, you just said it there. And the other one is very general and based on population research.
Okay, exactly. And, so this I just randomly grabbed and it was there, but a recent content analysis found that exactly, that the anti-vaccine messages predominantly use narrative and anecdote much more than the other ones do. So this may seem, interesting, but it does have some pretty serious consequences. So do you remember 2014, which was during that measles outbreak, the story of the Montags? So this was a family in Northern California. The parents were very much anti-vaccine oriented. And they even had their own blog where they collected stories of children who had been harmed by vaccines and posted this and was arguing why you should not vaccinate. Okay, 2014, the measles outbreaks, and these are their 2 children. So this is Allie and Paul. Allie, of course, the children were not vaccinated because that was the belief of the parents. Allie did get measles, so she was one of the, I think, 111 that contracted measles. Unfortunately, it actually went very bad, so her fever spiked. They took her to the emergency room. She went into convulsions. They tried to, do what they could, but eventually her organs started shutting down. She eventually died. So she was one of the few fatalities of the measles outbreak, which is tragic. But now the parents have a fairly interesting choice because they have Paul. Paul is unvaccinated. And it actually turned into quite this kind of back and forth in the blogosphere. So the anti-vaccine community that they were part of very much said, look, we're sorry this happened, this was a horrible thing, but it wasn't about vaccination. Don't vaccinate Paul, don't put him through all the dangers that go with vaccination. And then the other side also said, look, this happened, that's enough. You've got to vaccinate Paul. Even some of the grandparents, parents, said, you have to vaccinate our grandchildren. And it went back and forth for quite a while. In the end, the parents did decide to vaccinate Paul. However, I think where the story gets interesting is what happened after that. So what happened after the vaccination. And we're going to wait on that for a little cliffhanger to bring you through. But, so we see this problem that we have reliance on these anecdotes can lead to some serious and tragic events. So, we have this vaccine controversy. We have evidence-based safety from the pro side, where we have a narrative of harm. And here's a quote from the deputy director. This is like nothing I've ever seen before. It's an era where it appears that science isn't enough. And I would say that more than a possible diminishing faith in science, because there are surveys that show we still trust science a lot, it's likely a conflict between communication formats. So in this case, we have the anecdote, we have the narrative that's pulling people away from scientific consensus. Here we have an article that was published in Nature Methods, again, storytelling of scientific results that articulates a lot of these arguments. That narratives often result in a distorted and unrepresented display of data. Storytellers embellish and conceal information to evoke a response. Storytelling actively denies multiple interpretations, and narratives leave the reader with little to ponder or interpret. So, we start to see these arguments where narrative is pulling us away. Except it's not quite that simple, because here's another paper, How Providers and Parents Can Use Storytelling to Combat Anti-Vaccine Information. So there's other voices saying, no, 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 science, you need to go all in. You need to go into narratives. Does anyone know about Randy Olson? Mm-hmm. He was a tenured professor, and then got sick of it and decided to quit and go to Hollywood and start making documentaries and storytelling about science. And he's also published a lot of books. So here's one, Why Science Needs Story. Houston, we have a narrative. An earlier one he did is called Don't Be Such a Scientist. And he talks about when scientists communicate, they often stay up at the head, very logical and prescriptive. And he says there's all these other organs that you need to get into, the heart, the gut, the groin. This is where people have emotion and humor and passion. You need to bring that into science, and narratives can help do that. Story Collider. You ever heard of this? It brings true personal stories about science to life, weekly shows, podcasts, and they also teach scientists to use narrative in these workshops. And we even have the National Academy of Sciences, the Science and Entertainment Exchange. I didn't blow it up down here, but maybe you can see it. It connects entertainment industry professionals with top scientists and engineers to create a synergy between accurate science and engaging storylines in both film and TV programming. So they work with Hollywood, they work with writers and directors to try and get science into these narratives that people are watching. So, what's going on? We have one side, which is saying, look, science is not about anecdote, it's pulling people away. We need to move away from that. Yet we have the other side saying, no, science, we need to start using narratives. So that's what I'm going to talk about today. My goal today is to offer a theoretical foundation about how storytelling influences audiences, how storytelling intersects with science communication, important decision points if you decide to make a narrative, and then a couple ethical considerations. So first, quick activity, pull out a sheet of paper, take 30 seconds to make a bulleted list of what you did yesterday. And I know I'm being videoed, so if you're watching this, do it as well. Pull out a sheet of paper, make a bulleted list. All right, go. All right, time's up. Doesn't matter if you finish, you got something, and that's good enough. Okay, push that aside for a second. We're going to come back to that. So, I want you to think about these things. With science communication, where do you get your information about science? So then this is different, who you are and what you do. So just think about it. Where do I go to get my information? In what way is that presented to you from whatever source? What information sources do you trust, and which do you not? So, what we often see is there's some common formats of science communication. So the first is expository, which is very descriptive and explanatory. It just says, this is the way it is. This is truth, and you should accept it. Where you see these, textbooks, of course, very much that's what it's about. But fact sheets, you start to get these little brief handouts of this is the way something works. Here's what the science says. All right, that's expository. Argumentative takes that, but spreads it out so you have arguments that build up to support that final claim. So journal articles are very much built on this. You've got a results section, but you can't just say the results section. You have to say what you did, you have to set up the hypotheses, you have to show how it goes. Advocacy messages do this very much. I want you to believe this about whatever my science is. I'm going to give you arguments why you should move in this direction. Narrative takes that information and puts it into a story format. So this is where you have anecdotes. A lot of times documentaries use this story format. In personal conversation, we often fall back on a narrative and just tell stories to each other. And so you can have the same scientific content, but you can swap these formats. And one example I think does this nicely is usually, you go into a restroom and there's that sign put up right by the sinks that says, washing your hands is the single most effective way to stop the spread of disease. Right? You've seen those? Yeah, okay. Expository. It is. Washing your hands is the best way. Accept it. That's what you should do. If you take that information and try and move it into an argumentative format, the poster would say something like, here are the reasons why we know that washing your hands is the single most effective way. We know this, therefore this, now please wash your hands. If we take that down to a narrative side, it would be, if I have a picture of someone washing their hands, and it says, this is Laura. Laura washed her hands, and she stopped the spread of disease. Thank you, Laura. So again, same idea, but we have these different formats, different ways of communicating. So, narrative. What defines a narrative? I want to hear what you think. You know what a story is, but if you have to identify it as something other than another genre, what is it about narrative that makes it a narrative?
There's a character.
Okay, character.
Mm-hmm.
What else?
Beginning, middle, and end.
Okay, so we have some kind of temporal structure. That something happened first, which moved on to something else. Mm-hmm.
Some type of conflict?
Ooh, good. Let's see, I'm trying to think where this works in. But yes, conflict. So you can't just have this temporal structure, but there has to be some drama or something that breaks that so you can have a resolution.
Not always, but I would argue most of the time.
Yes, so there's that normal pyramid that we usually see the narrative structure. Very good. Anything else? Okay, so far so good. Those are kind of some of the easy ones I think come into play. Temporal sequence of events, cause and effect linkages, so something that happens in the narrative causes something else to happen. And the specific human-like characters. I say human-like because often it's humans, but a lot of times you can have narratives about animals or about particles or about anything, and they take on these human characteristics, which turn it into a narrative. Okay, so those make sense, but there's a couple more I want to describe. One thing that sets a narrative apart is its meaning is context dependent, whereas expository argumentative information is more context free. So if you think about a fact, which would be more the expository side, and I put that in a message, I could take that fact out, and I could walk over here and put it in another message, and it's still true. The fact still means what it means, so the facts are these kind of units that can move around. A narrative gets its meaning from that connection, from the cause and effect, from everything. So it gets its meaning from the entire piece. So if I rip out a part of a narrative, I can move it over here, but because it's not connected to whatever came before it and whatever consequences came afterwards, it loses a lot of its meaning when I take it out of that structure. So narratives actually become its own unit as opposed to things that you can swap in and out. Another difference is the direction of generalization. So expository, argumentative, gives you these grand truths about the world. These are facts, this is happening. And then from that, if you want to say, oh, what does that mean to me? You have to distill that down to a very specific case, which is yours. Okay, so if this is true, how am I going to deal with that? Narratives flip that and go the other way. They say, here's a specific. This thing happened to this person in this way. It doesn't tell you about those abstract truths, but what happens is you go the other way. You say, well, if that happened to that person, then what are the general truths that have to be in effect for that to have happened? So from that experience, you go up to say, well, what must be happening if that happened to that person? And we also evaluate them differently. So facts, we often go more for accuracy. Well, how do I know that that's true? Okay, where did that come from? What was the, especially in argumentative formats, what were the claims that came before that for me to accept that? With narrative, we focus more on coherence. So again, it's that kind of internal structure. Does the whole story hang together? Does it sound plausible? Is that something that the outcome, is that something I could see being linked to whatever happened at the beginning? And so we don't start to say, okay, tell me the source, tell me the background. It's if the whole narrative itself kind of has internal consistency, we're more likely to believe it. So quite a bit different between these two. Which is why it's said that narrative is actually its own cognitive pathway in our brain. So we have multiple pathways. Two of them here would be expository argumentative. If that message, if that type of information is coming to you, you're going to process it one way. But as soon as you hear a story, you're going to move over to another processing pathway. And it turns out that these paths are not equal. So there's been a number of studies that find narratives are easier to comprehend. It's a lot easier for us to wrap our head around what's happening. They're processed faster. So if I split the room in half and I gave you a narrative format and I gave you expository, this group would be done reading twice as fast pretty much. And it's also recalled easier. So this group reads it faster and they also get it more as opposed to the other group. They also carry greater weight in decision making. So exemplification theory, I think, is a perfect example of this. You guys talked about this at all? Okay, this is the idea that when you exemplify something with a specific case or an anecdote or a narrative, it does carry greater weight. And a lot of the studies put an anecdote or an exemplar in the same message as some base rate statistical expository information to see what happens. So, let's see, let's pick a new, we could do vaccines. Let's do something easy like shark attacks. So if you read something, I was at the beach not too long ago. So if you go to if you read something that says, yes, there has been great whites, but the chance of you being attacked by a shark, 0.1%. Okay, so if I read that, or people would read that, chances are like, oh yeah, not that big, very low risk. We're here, we're going to go out, we're going to go out in the ocean. Okay, now with exemplification, they would say, okay, let's leave that in there. Your chance of being attacked by a shark is 0.1%. But over here is Joe, who is a surfer, who was attacked last week and is missing a leg. Still, 0.01 or 0.1%, the chance hasn't changed. But now all of a sudden, Joe is sitting there, who is an example or an exemplar of this attack. Now I'm starting to get a little nervous. Even though it's still there, it's still 0.1%. And what studies find is the more of those cases that get put in the message, the more it pulls you the other way. So yes, it's safe, go swimming, 0.1%. Joe's missing a leg, Martha's missing an arm, and this person is too scared to ever go in again. But it's fine. So it's that same idea. You see those, and they carry such a great weight that now you're going to go swim in the pool instead of the ocean, even though that base statistical rate is the same. Okay, because of all this, the fact that they're easier to process, greater weight, it's said that stories are the default mode of human thought. So this is just how we make sense of the world. It's how we cognitively structure information to interpret reality. Now, we can learn to think more expository and to think logically, and that's actually one of the purposes of education, of schooling, is to help us think that way. But without that, children or people who have not had schooling often fall back to this narrative way of thinking. So let's see if it worked. How did you structure your bullet points? So I wanted to make you do it quick, so there was a lot of pressure, so you didn't really have time to think about it. But if you were falling back on your narrative mode, you probably just started doing it chronologically. Okay, I had Cheerios, I brushed my teeth,
No.
I did this, and I did this. But if you think about it, there was no prime. I didn't say to do it in any order. You could have done it by order of importance. So if something really important happened in your day, you could have put that first. You could have had many different structures. But how many people did it chronologically? Whoa, we have a narrative side of the room. Okay, so good. Often, that's how people kind of fall into it. So the people who did not, how did you structure it? Was it by importance?
I actually did it by importance first. I didn't realize that's what I was doing, and then I moved it into being chronological to make sure I didn't miss anything.
Ooh, interesting. Okay, what else?
Importance.
Importance? Was there something yesterday that was so important that it was kind of available in your mind to do that? Or did you just kind of fall into, that's just how I think about my day?
That's how I think about my day, for
Okay,
sure.
well, good for you. But that's the idea. So you can also kind of, give this test to other people, or when you go home, talk to your, significant other, your roommate or something, and just kind of see how they structure anything without any priming. Often you kind of fall into that structure. And so because of that, there's some scholars that have said, we are the narrative animal. That's one thing that sets us apart. Chimps now have been found to use a lot of tools. Used to be the tools set us apart. Now, these people say it's narratives that set us apart, that we think in the narrative formats, and so call us homo narratives. Okay, so now let's go more to science communication. If you think of science as a communication genre, so kind of that same thing with narrative, but now let's do it with science. What defines science? Often what you get are things such as an emphasis on efficiency, reliance on shared assumptions, removal of the personal. We want to talk in passive voice because it's not about the person, it's the idea. So there's a lot of things that kind of define what science is and how it's communicated. Within education, this is criticized as perpetuating a harmful mystique of science. It says that because this genre exists, it's seen as dogmatic, authoritarian, inhuman, because we purposely move the person out. It portrays the scientist as a genius, but the audience as a spectator. They're not involved in science. These other people are doing science. And so, again, within science education, there's calls to try and bring in more narrative, because narrative can make content more coherent, memorable, and meaningful. It provides that structure as opposed to some of these expository facts. It translates knowing into telling, as opposed to regurgitating facts. Can you put it together within this larger context? And it emphasizes interrelated sets of ideas. So I want to mention here some ways that narratives do impact the learning process. And three of the big ones are motivation and interest. They allocate cognitive resources in a different way, and it also elaborates into long-term schemas. So let's break these up real quick. For motivation and interest, narratives increase motivation and interest through dramatization, emotionalization, and personalization. Dramatization just means that you manage the order of information to always leave uncertainties about what might happen. So as long as there's that little hint of I'm not sure what's coming next, you stay with the message because you want to know what's happening. It's called narrative appetite. So if you've created a narrative appetite, the person wants to know more and will engage more with the story. And this desire for resolution pulls audiences through the entire message. Which is why, if you watch any network television, there's always the cliffhanger at the advertisements, because they want to leave that narrative appetite, because ads are so annoying that you don't leave. You say, okay, I'm going to watch this about a vacuum cleaner so I can see what happens next. So that's one. Emotionalization controls events and imagery to elicit emotive states. And research finds that more attention is paid to any content linked to emotions. And it really doesn't even matter if it's good or bad emotions. Anything that kind of sparks some emotional reaction, be somehow above or below that just kind of standard meh, all of a sudden is important. Your mind says, oh, there's something about this, and so there's more attention paid. Positive emotions lead to more thematic processing. So you start to think about, well, what does this mean? It's larger, how do things fit together? Negative emotions lead to more focused processing. And I think the theory behind this is interesting. It says that when you're scared, or when you're angry, or something is negative, it means that there's something bad, and you need to fix it. So you kind of focus way down, and you say, okay, I need to know this, so I can fix this problem. But if it's positive, if things are good, you can relax, you can sit in the field of flowers and look at the sun, and you can kind of think about these larger thematic ideas. So you can still kind of even change the degree of focus based on emotions. And personalization. Create characters and interactions to activate social responses. So even though within narratives we have characters which could be completely fictional, even if they're not fictional, they're not there. But the way that identification works, parasocial relationships work, we react to those characters as if we have some social connection. So that's identification. Parasocial relationships take that even farther to say we actually are in a social situation. So a lot of times, parasocial interaction, I mean, it happens within entertainment as well, but the classic one is your weathercaster. So you watch the news, the weathercaster tells you when everything's coming. You see that person every day. You're good friends, you know? So you feel like, yeah, I know you. And then the weathercasters say, yeah, when I'm out in the grocery store, everyone's coming up to say hi. I have no idea who these people are. But they've had that parasocial relationship. Anytime you have these social connections, it increases engagement. Okay, that's motivation and interest, so those are reasons it brings you in. Allocate cognitive resources. So the human mind has limited capacity for processing information. And I think you can see that anytime. If you're really trying to think about something, or you're really busy, and someone's trying to get your attention over here, or there's a car honking, and you just need to stop and you need to think. That's because we have limited capacity. And once it fills up, we're just stuck. Processing demands significantly influence comprehension. So if we really have to work at processing, it slows comprehension way down. We already mentioned this, but narratives already match that default structure of thought, so it's processed very quickly. Which means we can process narratives, a greater amount of narratives, because the processing demands are much lower. But if you look at what we're actually processing, that's different between expository and narrative. So expository argumentative, we're looking at the propositional relationships. So you've given me this fact, how does that relate to this fact? You're kind of begin building these claims and relationships between these abstract ideas. Narrative, you actually build a situation model. So you're trying to create I guess I don't have it up there, it's a story world. So interaction of events, causality, intentions, you're trying to create a representation of the world that this narrative is happening in, which allows you, and might not be accurate, but which allows you to say, okay, in the narrative it doesn't talk about these things, but because I understand the world, I think I know what would happen if this happened in the story. And so you're creating these different ways of making relationships. To show this, there's the idea of transportation, which says this is a state of engagement where you're so hyper-focused, so you're building the story world, and you're either so engaged because it's relevant or you enjoy it. For whatever reason, you're so focused on building and understanding the story world that it inhibits other cognition about the world around you. So this is the idea that you've been transported into a story, or you kind of lose track of what's happening because you're so engaged in the story. And what's been found is when you are transported, or the more transported you are, the more that you put your cognitive resources toward the narrative instead of everything else, the more these narrative effects happen. So it amplifies them. Okay, elaborate into long-term schemas. So schemas, I assume you've talked about this or heard about this. Schemas are the organizing structures in which we mentally file knowledge. Sometimes it's seen as like boxes in our head. I have new information comes in, and I have to organize it with my existing thoughts. We already said narratives are already in the appropriate filing system, so you don't have to decode it, you just kind of put the file where it goes. But the interconnectedness of narrative information, because that's how it's given to you, allows for easiest and more obvious connection to existing stores of knowledge. So a fact may come in, not connected to anything yet, and you have to figure out what box to put it in to connect it. And you might see one or two connections. But a narrative provides those connections. So not only does it tell you where to place it, it tells you how to connect it to other ideas and how closely to put it to other ideas. So in sum, narratives offer a method of structuring information that can benefit science communication. However, I still am going to go to the other side. There are people that say, no, in science education, narratives have no place. Because, and these are some of the other arguments, that may all be true, But narratives emphasize a particular event, and science focuses on repeatable phenomena. I want to understand this larger idea and not this. Narratives look back to make meaning from often unpredictable beginnings. So we ended here, we started here, but if you were here, there's no way you could have predicted where you would end up. But a narrative makes those connections, which makes it seem like, oh, if I start at A, I'll get to B. And the argument is you can't do that. You don't know where B is going to be. So you shouldn't rely on a narrative to do that. Narratives suggest certainty rather than the caution, circumspect, and tentativeness of science. And of course, we get the claim that anecdotes are not data. So these are things I want you to think about. There's all these cognitive benefits for narrative, but then there's also the side that says, but science is different. Science is not narrative, and there's a method to that. Okay, well let's say you're thinking, okay, yeah, this is kind of interesting. I might want to use some narrative. It gets tricky when we try and put this into practice, because narratives are complex communication structures, and it's more than just saying, I'm going to use a narrative. I'm going to step into the narrative box and do it. So let's think about this. If we go back to our vaccine example, and you want to construct a narrative about vaccines, how would you actually do it? So now you're facing a blank page or a blank screen or whatever, and you have to create it. There is lots of choices about how you could construct a narrative. So first you'd have to say, well, do I want text? Do I want to do a video? I can do different things and visual things with video. Text, I have to use more abstract ideas. Character depictions within the story. Who are the characters? There's probably multiple characters. Who am I going to focus on? If I want to move toward identification or parasocial relationships, I have to know my audience enough to choose someone that relates. Plotline. What happens in the story? You could have a loss frame or a gain frame. Do I want to show someone succeeding? Do I want to show someone losing? What's going to be the difference? First or third person? Am I the character? Is someone talking about the character? How long do you want this to be? How long do you think your audience will give you? So are we talking 1,000 words, 3,000 words, 20 minutes? Description and vividness. So yes, you've got plot, you know what's happening. How much time do you take describing what's happened? I mean, there's so many choices. And this is a very current area of research. So if you're interested in this, this is happening right now. So active area of research, trying to decide where are these impactful decision points about when you construct a narrative. There's a lot, and there's a lot that's still kind of in question. So I'll tell you a couple that seem to be trending that yes, it's something we can talk about. One is narrativity, which is the range and depth with which a story can have a rich representation of the story world. So that kind of means not what the content is, but how much description and vividness is in there. So description, character development, lasting consequences, multiplicity of possible storylines. This is kind of a complexity of the narrative. And it turns out that increased narrativity corresponds to greater engagement and emotional responses. So that's one thing. Even so, it still doesn't tell you what detail to include. So that's still something you have to consider. But then it also confounds with length. So you could say, yes, I want to make this very high narrativity story, which now goes to 5,000, 6,000, 10,000 words. It's much more detailed, but now you start losing people because I don't want to read a 10,000 word story. So you got a lot of these things. Point of view. First person point of view seems to relate to greater impacts than third person point of view. However, this is limited to health communication contexts. So a lot of health communication narratives kind of tend to cluster around these stories of, here's someone who was smoking and I'll tell you a story why you shouldn't smoke. And here's someone who ate healthy and lost a lot of weight. So I mean, it's kind of a narrow ribbon of what type of narratives are used. And within this, it turns out first person seems to have more of an effect. It's unknown if this goes to other narrative constructions. Causality. So how do you incorporate the science into the story? Scientific content that's incorporated into the narrative at plot points such that the science causes things to happen results in greater recall, greater acceptance, longer duration of effect, and it seems to be independent of worldviews or ideologies. So depending on if you're very pro-left, pro-right, I mean, whatever continuum you want to use, If within the story the science causes something to happen, it's acceptable, as opposed to an aside. So you have a story where something's happening, and then two characters have a break, and they're like, hey, let's talk about some science. Has no relation to anything, they go back. Not as effective, but if science causes something, it does. And so you've got all these possible factors that the communicator controls. These are just some of them. Identifiable characters, imaginable plot, coherence, dramatic pacing, emotional imagery, alignment of science content. So you still have all of these choices. But even so, it's hard because the audience brings their own factors to the interpretation of the narrative. So they bring prior knowledge, topical interest, expectations, worldviews, transportability, which is a trait measure of how likely you are to be transported in the narrative. Distractions to engagement. I mean, everything else could be aligned, but if you've got a dog right next to you barking nonstop, you can't engage. Everything else seems to be lined up, but it doesn't happen. Which is why social science can identify these impactful decision points. You need to think about point of view. You need to think about plot. But it still takes creative and talented storytellers to make those decisions to create something meaningful for a particular audience. Okay, still one more thing to talk about. We're right on time. So we talked about how important narrative is, how it's easy to process. It does lead to biases. So facts rarely influence existing narratives, but are interpreted through them. And actually, if you are in PR or advertising, I mean, this is a clear strategy. If you have a competitor, and you know the competitor is going to say some things about you, if you give your consumers a narrative as opposed to facts, then you can counteract what you know is coming. So the competitor gives facts, but you've already created a narrative which shows how to interpret those facts. And you interpret it, again, in the way that benefits you. So this leads to ethical considerations, that we have one that is just so much stronger in how we make decisions than the other. So one is, narratives are intrinsically persuasive. When you create a narrative, all those decisions we talked about, they're subjective. There's not an objective way to say, what is the best point of view? What is the best character? You have to decide. I think for my audience, this is the narrative that will work. So you have to make a lot of subjective choices, but you never justify them. You don't have in the narrative, here's what happened, and here's something, and by the way, here's the reason I chose the character the way I did. It's not there. So you don't justify it, and so the story itself demonstrates the claim, and the conclusion seems inevitable, even though many possibilities could have happened. So you are creating more certainty based around your subjective choices. So we'll go back to this idea of transportation, that the more you get engaged, the larger the effect. The transportation imagery model says that when people are so transported, they use enough cognitive resources that they're unable to generate counterarguments, which means acceptance is the default outcome. So if I'm so engaged in the story, and there's something in the story that's not true, I mean, okay, if it's blatantly not true, it breaks your transportation and you're out of it. But if you're within and something comes that's untrue, you don't have the capacity to continue to be transported and still counteract it. So after a narrative, usually you accept what it is. Now, you can still reject it, of course, but it takes more cognitive scrutiny. So the narrative's done, you say, I don't buy it for this reason, and now you've switched out of narrative processing, and you're thinking more to argument. But a lot of times we don't do that. You finish the narrative, and you're like, oh, yeah, that's interesting. Okay, what's over here? And you just accepted what it was because you haven't taken that. Entertainment overcoming resistance model, another one, which says that narratives are good at overcoming audiences that would otherwise be resistant. So if I came to an anti-vax group, and I said, I'm going to give you reasons why vaccines are good, they're going to be resistant. But this model says if instead you put that into a narrative, it will be more effective because the audience doesn't even realize they're being exposed to a persuasive message. It's just a story. It's just this factual story I'm going to tell you, even though it's actually persuasive. Many health campaigns use this idea to influence behavior. So I'm not going to tell you to eat more healthy. I'm going to try and package it into a narrative where you don't even know I'm telling you to be more healthy. And there's a lot of examples, I think one that did a very good job of assessment, which is why I said example is used a lot, was in Tanzania. The government wanted to work on family planning because there wasn't, it just wasn't an issue. The population was growing, contraceptives were not accepted, and the government wanted to work on this. And so at first, they kind of did this campaign, a traditional persuasion campaign, to say, talk to your partner about contraceptives, talk about how many children you want. Complete failure. But then, there was this group that came in, an entertainment education group, that created a soap opera, a radio soap opera, that was just entertaining. But within the content, the main character talked about family planning. It was worked into plot points. The foil or the fool was the one who did not use condoms and basically did all the behaviors that the government didn't want you to do. And it was, Tanzania at the time, it was not a developing media environment. So it was a soap opera on the radio. There weren't many media outlets. So it was listened to by a large proportion of the population. And it actually had a pretty big effect. So because of that, people who listened, people who were engaged, they went back, not because they wanted to learn about family planning, but because I want to see what happened to this guy. There was a cliffhanger. But through that, they started to change their behaviors to match this. So I think all these get to some ethical questions. So think about how narratives are being used within contentious science issues. What is the appropriate role of science communication within these controversies? Is it, I want to persuade you to accept this view about science, and I don't even care if you realize I'm moving you, but I'm going to do whatever it takes to get you here? Or is it to clarify understanding and to engage a wider public? I want to use narrative to say, you don't care about this, but I want you to be engaged, and now I want you to democratically decide what you want, and whatever it is fine. Because they're both used a lot. And you can use narrative to do either one. So if comprehension is what you want, choose events that explain all the sides around the science issue, portray a character that's neutral to the issue, or multiple characters that show both sides, emphasize the underlying societal values that intersect with the issues. You're trying to facilitate engagement and discussion. Or if you don't want that, you can say, I just want to persuade you. I'm going to choose an event that explains the preferred side of the issue, portray the character that either agrees with the preferred side or learns to do so. So we see this person slowly take on the position we want. And conceal or undermine the values underlying the opposing side. So it's not that narratives are either pro or anti-science. They can be used in many different ways depending on whatever your goal as a communicator is. A couple other ethical things to think about. External realism. What aspects of the narrative need to stay accurate to the real world, and where can accuracy be relaxed for the larger purposes of communication? So this is completely not externally valid. Yeasts do not have faces. They don't poop out carbon dioxide in that way. But we can relax the external realism on that because the process is true. The process is accurate. And so in this case, I could say, I want to talk about this, so this will remain accurate. But within the narrative, I'm going to let myself kind of make it up and go beyond what's true because that will draw people into this. But those are inner choices. What is it? Someone else could say, no, you kept this accurate, but you're wrong. This should have been accurate. And so you've made an inappropriate choice. Representativeness. So remember, audiences will generalize from a narrative example. I give you this. Oh, well, what must be the case for that to be true? So should the example be representative of the issue? Should it be one of those blue fish, that this is often what's going to happen? Or is it okay to pick the outlier, a worst case or best case scenario, to say this happened to the person? Because the person will extrapolate out from a best or worst case outlier, and they might come up with different general truths than if you gave one in the middle. So again, more choices. And there's research that's starting to kind of take the audience point of view. So it's not, as a communicator, what should or shouldn't I do? But this was in Journal of Health Communication, and they talked to audiences about these strategies. And what I think is important is it says, viewers evaluate the use of currently investigated attitudinal statements about potential persuasive strategies as being immoral. So as soon as a lot of these people said, oh, that that's what they're doing to me? They're trying to trick me into accepting this through a story? Well, now I'm mad. So it's that idea that as long as you don't know what's happening, you start to see an effect, but when that persuasive intent becomes realized, there's pushback. All right, ready here? What happened? So in fact, I'm actually going to ask you what you think happened. I'm going to give you two choices. So the Montags did vaccinate Paul. So do you think what happened after vaccination is, okay, these are going to be very different. I want to see which one you think happened. That later in that year, there was another measles outbreak at the school. So Paul was exposed, but he did not get measles. And so the story has become kind of a poster child for the pro-vaccine side, saying, look, we had this anti-vax family, made a good choice, and look what happened. That's A. Option B, Paul got the shot, and unfortunately became another person with those rare side effects. Because there are side effects. We can't say vaccines don't have them. But just by bad luck, he got these horrible side effects. It was another fever spike, went into the hospital, more convulsions. He did not die, so it didn't go that far. But it turned out to be a poster child for the anti-side, saying, look what happened. This family gave their child a vaccine. They were told it was safe. And now, look, we should all follow them. So what do you think happened? How many people think it was A? Just a couple. How many people think it was B? We cannot abstain, people. All right, so pick A. Okay, and how many people think B?
Optimism and pessimism.
Okay.
Yeah, right.
So here's what really happened. You ready? Neither of them happened. I just made the whole story up. So this is just something I pulled from Google Images. It's not even something family portrait pictures. But I wanted to do that to show storytelling can be a powerful method of sharing the excitement. So by telling that at the beginning, hopefully that got you interested, it drew you in, set up that narrative appetite to pull you forward. Narratives are neither.
Now we are mad, right?
And you see, I put the 2014 measles epidemic in a previous slide
Yeah.
as cover to show why that setting might be possible. So narratives are neither intrinsically pro or anti, so you can see how the same story can easily veer off in either direction and become the reigning story of whatever side wanted it. Narrative is a simulation of human experience with all the complexities and contradictions. There were a lot of choices I could have made about how to make that story, and I had to pick some. And finally, ethical implications. I completely manipulated you with a lie for most of that. Is that appropriate? There would be some people that would say, you know what, if it brought people to my side, whatever happens to be, yes, it's appropriate, because it's utilitarian and it's justified means. Other people would say, oh no, that's right, now I'm mad at you. Now I don't believe anything else you said in the whole presentation. But again, it gets to that ethical question. So that's what I got. Thank you very much.